G'day wherever you may be around the world, and thank you for your company once again on truth2u.org. That's truth number 2 letter u.org. Joining me is the Director of Education and Counselling for Jews for Judaism in Canada. The website is jewsforjudaism.ca. That's jewsforjudaism.ca. Welcome back to the program, Rabbi Michael Skobac.
And a blast to be here with you.
It's always great to have you on the program, my friend. We are continuing in our series exploring the book of Psalms, chapter by chapter, and asking the question, who composed the psalm? What is it about, and what was happening in the life of the author at the time of the composition? How does it apply to us today? Also, when applicable, what would Christianity have us believe about each psalm, and how does that deviate from the original intent? This week, we are in Psalm chapter 15. Again, it's a really short one, but I don't know if it's going to be a short program. It only has 5 verses, would seem. It's a Psalm of David, and it's an interesting subtitle in my New King James study Bible, the Christian translation. It says, "The character of those who may dwell with the Lord." It begins like this, Michael. It says, "Lord, who may abide in your tabernacle? Who may dwell in your holy hill? He who walks uprightly and works righteousness and speaks the truth in his heart. He who does not backbite with his tongue, nor does evil to his neighbor, nor does he take up a reproach against his friend, in whose eyes a vile person is despised, but he honors those who fear the Lord. He who swears by his own hurt and does not change. He who does not put out his money at usury, nor does he take a bribe against the innocent. He who does these things shall never be moved." Michael.
We should be happy that with this psalm we'll be finishing 1/10 of the book of Psalms.
How about
150 chapters. That's nice.
Yeah.
I see that we're on our way.
When did we start this? When did we start this series?
Oh, half a year ago.
So that means we do 20% of the first psalm. That's 5 years. So in 5 years we'll be done.
Unless we speed up.
Well, it's possible.
But we have some of these.
The chapters only get longer, though.
Psalms.
The chapters only get longer.
They're going to get really big.
Yeah.
So actually, we should have been going faster already. So I find this psalm interesting because we've been doing all these psalms where the theme has always been, I guess, since we began Psalm 2. Up until the last Psalm, Psalm 14, it was always focusing on those rotten, wicked people. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's been a major theme of virtually all the other Psalms. Even the first Psalm contrasts those who are righteous with those who are wicked. But the other Psalms all are these basically laments or complaints by David, about either the people that were trying to kill him, or the people that were rooting for the people who were trying to kill him, or the people who were happy that he was being sought after to be killed, or he was talking in general about wicked people. But this psalm doesn't really focus on that at all. And it seems to break the pattern and begin. I think the next few psalms will focus similarly on the topic of, how do we understand the definition of righteous people, good people, people who are worthy in the eyes of God? And so
it is a shift. I mean, it seems to be a psalm. Well, it is a psalm of instruction. I mean, is that fair? I mean, the last Psalm 14 was kind of along those lines as well, and it was a little bit different. This again is a psalm of instruction to people, but you're right. It focuses on moral character. Is that fair?
Yeah, really sort of fleshing out what does it mean to be the kind of person who is worthy of dwelling in the presence of God, which in the Psalms comes up frequently. This idea of dwelling on the mountain of God, or dwelling in the sanctuary of God, or dwelling in the presence of God, or it's expressed in many different ways, but it's a theme that comes up repeatedly in the book of Psalms, this desire on the part of David to basically have this ongoing, intimate relationship with God. I think it's in chapter 27, if I'm not mistaken, where he says, there's one thing that I ask for, one thing that I seek. And he says to live in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, and to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to worship in his temple. That's the one thing that David says he is seeking. Like if he had one wish, that would be it. And so it comes up frequently. And here he's focusing on the question of, who's worthy. It's interesting that the same question comes up also in Psalm 24, where David says, who may ascend the mountain of the Lord, and who may stand in his place? So it's asking the same question that's being asked here, implicitly asked here. It's not so much, here it's asked as a question. Who may live in your tent, who may dwell on your holy mountain? So who has the qualities to be worthy? And in Psalm 24, it gives a similar answer. He who has a clean hands and a pure heart, who has not taken my name in vain, who has not sworn deceitfully. So there, it's not it's a very brief description.
That was just sorry to interrupt, but you said who has not taken my name in vain. It's really interesting in the translation that I'm looking at. Who has not lifted up his soul to an idol, nor sworn deceitfully. Interesting.
I guess when we get to Psalm 24, we're going to have to battle that one out.
We'll have a look at that one when we get there. Yeah, but it's but you're right. It asks the same question. This one kicks off by saying, he who walks uprightly, works righteousness, and speaks truth in his heart. The first thing I suppose that comes to one's mind is, well, how do we define those three things? How do we define walking uprightly, righteousness, and truth? That immediately took me to Psalm 119, as so many things do. And when it comes to truth, for example, all your commandments are truth. Psalm 119, verse 151 and 160, the entirety of your word is truth. Every one of your righteous judgments endures forever. As for righteousness, Psalm 119, verse 172, my tongue shall speak of your word. All of your commandments are righteousness.
Yeah, that's really defining these terms, but here it's interesting that David is focusing on the person who speaks truth in his heart. It could have just simply said the one who speaks truthfully. And, the question is, what does it mean to speak about having truth in your heart?
Well, I guess one can say the right things knowing what the right things are to say, but whether you actually think those sincerely or not, whether you believe those to be true, may be a different thing. Is that fair? So
having some kind of a consistency between our speech and our heart.
Well, yeah, because I think the words are lip service. One can pay lip service. One can, we all usually know the right things to say. Whether we actually believe it or not may be a different matter.
See, in those cases, you may question whether the person is speaking truthfully. They may be speaking the right kind of things, what's polite, but it may not be truthful. There are many times when, in order to preserve the peace, so to speak, we may not really be totally truthful. Is this? What do you think about my new car? So what are you going to say?
That's a very interesting pink.
But if they see in your heart, you think it's hideous. You're just trying to be politically correct, or you're trying to be diplomatic. And that may not be, purely telling the truth. So it is interesting what you're raising, this sort of sometimes dichotomy between what we say and what we really feel deep down inside. The Talmud has an interesting spin on what this means to speak the truth in your heart. They tell a story of one of the sages, Rabbi Safras. And he was once praying. He was in the middle of his prayers, and he had something for sale. I don't remember the exact story, but he was selling cow or something, or he was selling a goat. And I guess in the classified ads, he said that he's got a cow or a goat for sale, and someone came by and wanted to make an offer. And so the fellow offered, let's say, 100 zuz or whatever he offered. And because Rabbi Safras was in the middle of praying, he wasn't able to answer. He couldn't interrupt his prayers. So he basically didn't say anything. And this fellow assumed that he was rejecting the offer. He's not going to accept that. So the guy upped his offer to 200 zuz. And I think he again couldn't speak. And so the guy, I think, went up a third time to 300 zuz. And the story in the Talmud is that when the guy first offered 100 zuz, that was what he was prepared to sell it for initially. He was very happy to take that price. He just couldn't say that he was going to agree to it. And so when he finished praying, he told the guy that he's willing to sell it for 100, even though the fellow had already offered 300. He could have been less than honest and taken the $300, which was offered by this fellow. But since in his heart he had already resolved to take 100, that was an example of.
No, I'm taking the 300. That's not. What kind of salesman was the rabbi? Come on. The first person to talk in negotiation is the one who loses. You got to let that's 300. A product is only worth as much as one is willing to pay for it. If he wants to pay 300, sure, that's what it's worth.
No, exactly. I mean, that's why. By the way, it's interesting that it's not so easy to do this, but the way that many of the traditional Jewish commentaries read this psalm is that it's not speaking about basic requirements of ethical behavior, because they assume that to do that, like not to rip people off, that's not super worthy. It just means you're not a criminal. And so they look at all of these. There are 11. These are 11 basic ideas that David is sharing. That all of these are somewhat going beyond the letter of the law, meaning that theoretically you could take the 300 and be perfectly within your rights. I mean, the fellow was willing to pay it. And after all, if you're trying to get a good price for your goat or your cow or whatever it is, why not? But here is an example of exemplary behavior, because he felt that since he had in his heart, been happy, he was happy once the person offered the 100. So in his heart, that was the truth, and he stuck with it. So
just to take that further into, if he had advertised it anywhere or said to somebody officially, I want 100 for it, it's worth 100. Then to take 300 to someone who was unaware of perhaps the sign you put on the community notice board or whatever it might be, then that could be a little dishonest. The person may go away and then see the sign that says, "I've got a goat, I'm selling it for 100." He would almost be in his right to take it back and say, what's going on?
Price went up.
Come on, you advertise it for 100, and you anyway. So there would be cause for upset there, I would think.
That would be a different case. Here the price had not been advertised.
Okay.
Now what's more difficult?
Yeah, I am. Yeah. What's more difficult?
Don't come to my house when I'm praying. If you want to buy my lawnmower. So the question is, what does it mean, to speak about someone who walks uprightly? It's somewhat vague, and to say someone acts righteously. They seem like general descriptions of, people that are living exemplary lives, but it's not very well defined to say, that the person who walks uprightly and acts righteously. Speaking truth in the heart is, also hard to define. But it's less vague. It's more, in some ways, precise. So that's the problem with this first verse here. Who may merit to live in God's presence? What does it mean to walk uprightly? How exactly is that defined? What does it mean to act righteously? So I think that we might say possibly that the rest of this psalm is giving examples of these first two opening salvos. What does it mean to walk uprightly and to act righteously? And then the rest of them seem to be pretty precise.
Yep.
And maybe examples of what this is.
I'm going to switch to my Jewish study Bible because honestly I just prefer this translation when it comes to this psalm. Just to read verse 2 again, he who lives without blame, who does what is right, and in his heart acknowledges the truth. Verse 3, whose tongue is not given to evil, who has never done harm to his fellow or borne reproach for his act towards his neighbor. It says, for whom a contemptible man is abhorrence. That's an interesting choice of words. It paints a picture of someone who is not willing to compromise on what they believe to be true.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Often we might think of a really, really righteous person as someone who doesn't necessarily have contempt for people that are wicked. I mean, maybe they because we've spoken about this in the past. Do you despise the sinner or the sinner's sin? Mm-hmm. Here it seems to be speaking about having contempt for the person. Mm-hmm. And, there are other places in Psalms where it speaks about, hating the sinner and desiring that sins be uprooted. I think it's one of the verses in the book of Psalms. Yitamu chatayim in haaretz. Mm-hmm. Let sins be wiped out from the face of the earth. But we don't seek the destruction of the sinner. So it's interesting that here, I guess you're right, this person is so principled. This person has such strong standards for himself or herself that they just can't tolerate wicked people. And so they nothing but contempt for but here I have it translated as, who has nothing but contempt for a vile man. So I guess it's pretty strong personality.
And on the other hand, who honors those who fear the Lord.
Right. Which is the flip side.
Yeah.
Now, some of these are not so simple to understand. It's interesting that he speaks about not spreading gossip, and the Hebrew word is interesting. The Hebrew word is lo ragal al lishono. Now, the word ragal, it even sounds similar in English to the word regular. Mm-hmm. But the word in Hebrew is similar to regel, which means foot. Now, what does foot have to do with slander, with someone who speaks? What's the translation that you have?
I've got, whose tongue is not given to evil, who has never done harm to his fellow.
Yeah, so the evil tongue, we speak in Hebrew about lashon hara, specifically slandering people. Sometimes it could be just wicked gossip.
Yeah, or
but
false accusation.
Interesting. That might be different because that's lying. In the Bible, usually gossip is true. It's not once you're lying about them, you're actually doing something worse. But the Torah law prohibits even things that are true that are just not complimentary or that are diminishing of people. And the Torah uses this word of ragal or regel, like in the Bible it says lo telech rachil be'amecha in Leviticus 19:16. Now, that's the prohibition against speaking what we call, about people in a negative way. And there the word is not regel, but rachil. Now, etymologically, those words are related. Regel, foot, and rachil means a peddler. So they speak about don't peddle information. Now, obviously,
so transporting the story, is that what it's referring to?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, you're dealing in stories. You're a spreader, and you're walking around, right? And that's what a peddler does. A peddler is usually, back then they didn't have a bicycle or a car; they walked.
Yeah. So not only are they spreading gossip, but they're going out of their way to, be the first one with the news. Oh, did you hear what happened to such and such? Oh, I think it's, it's this and that, and blah 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 blah. And then off they are to the next house or whatever. They want to be the first in with the news, and to spread it around. And
that's one of the most insidious parts about it is that the spreading of it, because it becomes something which takes on a life of its own. It goes viral. Once it's out there, it goes viral. You can't really take it back so easily. So that's an interesting term in the Hebrew. It may not come through so clearly in the English. And then I wanted to go back for a second, if I could, to verse 2, where he speaks about the person who speaks about holech tamim, which I think you said it was someone who walks uprightly.
Yeah, uprightly. Now that's in the New King James. In the Jewish Study Bible, I've got he who lives without blame, who does what is right. We have that description of Job, don't we?
Yes, and the word in Hebrew here is tamim, which is related to the word tam. It comes up, I think, the first time in Genesis 6, verse 9, about Noah, who was referred to as a tzaddik tamim, a perfectly righteous person. So tam, or tamim, can mean perfect or whole. Jacob, in Genesis 25, verse 27, is called an ish tam. There it's not clear what it means, because it can mean simple. But usually it means whole, and whole in a very pure kind of way. There's a fascinating verse in Deuteronomy 18, verse 13, which says, Tamim tihya im Hashem Elokecha. You shall be tamim, perfect or whole, with the Lord your God. And it's in the context of all of these prohibited occultic practices, like they speak about don't use divination and don't be a soothsayer and don't. And then after all those prohibitions, it says you should be whole with the Lord your God, meaning don't try to take shortcuts and outmaneuver God and come up with. Don't try and beat the system, and basically go through life, without using all of these techniques to try and see what's up ahead. Go through life with this sort of more whole, plain, simple, uncorrupted walk with God. You don't have to. Don't game the system, or whatever the expression is. Don't look for devices to somehow gain an advantage, or get an upper hand on the way God runs the world. God knows what he's doing, and you should be wholehearted, tamim, with God. God says to Abraham in Genesis 17:1, Hitalech lefanai veheye tamim, walk before me and be tamim. Again, blameless or perfect or innocent. So it is, a word which we do find in the Bible, although it's not 1,000,000% clear what it means to walk blameless. Because again, it's not clear that tamim means exclusively blameless. Tam, again, can mean perfect or innocent. It speaks here about, in verse 4, as you were just saying, that in his eyes, the vile person is despised. The Talmud gives an interesting example of this. We know that Hezekiah's father was a wicked person. His father was Ahaz, and who was an idolater. So the Talmud says that Hezekiah didn't give his father any rights of honor after he died, meaning that even his father he didn't flatter, he didn't give honor to. And actually the Talmud goes further and says that he dragged his bones on a bed of rope. He sort of treated him with, he treated him in a debasing kind of way, even though it was his father, but he was an idolater. And so the Talmud gives that as an example.
Now you know what? You've just opened a can of worms because
I love doing that. That's why this is not going to be a 5-minute show.
Here we are in the commandment to honor your mother and your father, Exodus chapter 20, and here in 15:4, for whom a contemptible man is abhorrent, but who honors those who fear the Lord. And the question then becomes, well, do we only honor our parents if they fear the Lord, and we don't if they're idolaters?
So honoring our parents does not depend upon them fearing the Lord. We are commanded to honor, and not just honor, but to have awe, hold our parents in awe. Mm-hmm. Both words are used. Kabed es avicha v'es imecha, honor your father and mother, and es imecha v'avicha tir'ah. You shall be in awe. Fear. Well, fear is not really a great word. And it doesn't say that it depends upon them being righteous, God-fearing people.
So then is this story of Hezekiah putting him at fault?
The Talmud doesn't see it that way.
No.
I mean, the Talmud seems to say that normally you are required to honor your parents. Now, what's interesting is that you could ask the question: does that only apply when they're alive? Are you required to honor them after they're no longer on this earth? That's certainly a question worth asking. But it seems that they're saying that you'd make an exception to this, that you would not honor parents who themselves did not honor God. For example, the Talmud speaks about the simple question about, what if your parents ask you to violate the Sabbath? Do you have to honor them and obey their request? So the Talmud says no. And they base it upon verses in the Bible that even the parents are required to honor the Sabbath. So if they ask you to violate it, you're not required to honor your parents in that situation. So the parents that go to the extreme, and he wasn't just an innocent idolater. He was like a major league idolater. So they don't see this as a violation of his requirement to honor his parents.
Certainly, Hezekiah's father was not to the scale of his son. The interesting thing about it is, of course, that in Exodus 20, we've jumped. Well, I suppose we're still on topic, but I'm going to go here. Exodus 20, verse 12: honor your father and your mother, that you may long endure on the land that the Lord your God assigns to you. The interesting thing about that, of course, is that Hezekiah was given his marching orders, and he had Isaiah pray on his behalf, and God granted him an extra 15 years. And during that time, we unfortunately he begot Manasseh. I'm just it's interesting that the Talmud would have a story like that, where Hezekiah seems to dishonor his father in an extreme way, and yet we do have in the text that he was granted extra longevity on the land,
and a horrible son,
and a horrible son as a result of that. Yeah.
Interesting how that works out. Yeah,
now that I can see that turning into an hour-long conversation. Yeah.
I'll share one other translation, by the way, of this phrase, because it's not easy to translate. Normally, it is translated as someone who has contempt for the wicked, but the Radak translates it as he is despicable in his own eyes and repulsive. Meaning that I think it's an extreme way of putting it, but I think it's an expression of humility. That even though this person is, obviously, if you look at the person profiled in this chapter, he's a pretty good guy, and yet he doesn't hold himself up as a pretty good guy. You think that a person like this could walk around very proud of himself, and so the Radak says, no, despite all of these wonderful character traits, he always sees himself as less than. He doesn't see himself as. In fact, there's a thing I once heard from one of my teachers in Jerusalem. He said, if you have two people in front of you, one of them is really, really wicked, and one of them is really, really righteous, which one is more likely to think of themselves as good? So the truth is that it's more likely the really wicked person is going to think of himself as good, because the really righteous person is going to say, I could have been better. I could have done better. So that it's an interesting translation by the Radak. Like one question, which maybe we'll get to a little bit later, is why specifically these 11 qualities? Is there something that's special about these in particular? Because the truth is, if we sat down and brainstormed, we could probably come up with a longer list of qualities, of honorable qualities. It speaks here about the person who, now again, I'm not sure how you translated it, but in my translation, it's the person that swears to their detriment.
Now, I like the way
does
that,
not change.
now swears to that detriment. That's really good. And I like the way also that it is in the Jewish Study Bible here, who stands by his oath even to his hurt.
So what would that be talking about?
If he's made a pledge to do something, and in the course of the time that it comes to bring that to fruition, and it's no longer in his favor, he still goes ahead and does it because he's put his name to it, if you like.
Okay, so that's a great example. That maybe when they first made the oath, things were not going to be as detrimental, and then maybe at some point it changed and became detrimental, and he's going to just stick to it because that's the oath that he made. It's not as unusual as we think it is. There are many times we make commitments in life, even though if we don't, let's say, technically make an oath, but we make commitments. We say, well, we intend to do something. We, give the impression to someone that, this is our intention. And, we might have a change of heart, or circumstances might change. And, as far as we're concerned, we have every right in the world. I didn't, intend to do this if something would have changed. But people that are on a high level stick to their word. It's interesting that it's speaking specifically not about someone who sticks to their oath, but sticks to their oath even to their detriment. That seems to be the noble part here, because you could maybe say that when it's to their detriment, maybe the oath doesn't technically apply anymore if such circumstances changed. And this person is so honest and so, scrupulous that even if technically they might be able to get out of something because the circumstances changed, they stick to their original commitment.
Sure.
And then it speaks about not giving money on interest. Now, why is that virtuous? I mean, the Bible prohibits it. Again, it would seem to mean that the person is not a criminal. That's not virtuous. That's what the law requires. It's in Leviticus chapter 25, verse 37, I believe.
Yeah, specific.
So there are a few ways in which the commentaries deal with this. One, they say, well, it could be a case where the person is so eager to receive a loan, he's so desperate, the person basically almost, begs him and prevails upon him to give him the loan, and he says, and of course I can't just take the money with no interest. So it could be a case where it's not that, it's just a normal case of loaning money to someone, but the person was really the person didn't mind. Let's say the person didn't mind at all. He was very happy to pay the interest, and he was in desperate need of a loan.
The higher the risk, the loan, the more desperate one is to secure a loan. And yeah, you're right. They may offer and say, "Look, I don't mind. I'll pay you interest. Just give me the loan. I really need it. I really want it."
And maybe that wouldn't be a violation of the biblical commandment, possibly. Another possible issue is whether or not that prohibition applies to lending money to non-Jews. This is the famous, issue of how Jews became known as moneylenders. That the Bible prohibited, lending money to fellow Jews with interest, but not to others. And
to your brethren is what it says. And so if I get this right, I think the Christians thought, well, my fellow Christian is my brethren. The Jews are not. Therefore, we can get the Jews to charge the interest, and we're not violating the commandment. Is that the way they thought it through?
Well, not just they, but I mean, we also apparently made that distinction based upon our understanding of the scripture that technically speaking, the prohibition does not apply to non-Jews. And so here, the person, is the kind of person that's not going to take interest even from non-Jews, even though, again, technically speaking, they'd be allowed to. Another possibility is that the word in the verse here is a pretty strong word. The word is kaspo lo nosan baneshech. Neneshech means literally to bite, and it's a violent kind of biting. I think if I remember correctly, I have to double check this, but if I remember correctly, Rabbi Akiva, the great sage, he was an ignoramus. He was illiterate until he was about 40 years old. And he began studying Torah when he was 40. But he wasn't only ignorant. He said about himself that he hated Torah scholars. He hated them. And he says at one point that he said, I hated them so much that if I saw one, I would bite him like a donkey's bite. I would. Now, obviously, he's being, he's exaggerating for effect.
Yeah, hopefully, he's speaking.
He's being hyperbolic.
Yeah,
a little bit of hyperbole. But the bite of a donkey is a pretty vicious bite. It's not like getting bit with the gums of an infant that's not got teeth yet. So the word here is interesting because there's another word that we have for interest, which is ribit. Sounds like a frog. So here it's a different word. Here it's to bite, or really a better word would be in terms of the context here, gouge. And so he's saying that it could be that there are situations where it's okay to lend money with interest, for example, to the person who is willing to pay the interest, or let's say the person that's not Jewish. It may be permissible, but this person is not someone who gouges. He's not like a loan shark that's going to, let's say, ask for an exorbitant rate of interest, or someone who is going to, be vicious when it comes to getting paid back. So he might be speaking about that kind of a situation.
I've just reached for my collection of Shakespeare, and because it reminds me of the Merchant of Venice, and I'm not sure if that's fair, but when you say bite, it reminds me of that pound of flesh that he lends. Maybe it is a fair comparison.
Interesting. Wow. I have to confess that I never read The Merchant of Venice.
You haven't? Oh.
No, we did a little bit of Shakespeare when I was in high school, but we never got to that.
Yeah, it's not really kind to us, to be honest. But but it's just the you remind me when you use the word bite, when you use the word interest, lending. Now, I do believe he's lending to a Christian. And in fact, I seem to recall him saying that I despise him for he is a Christian, and I will impose such a heavy interest upon him. I'll have to read it again. But
do you remember the cartoon, The Wizard of Id?
No.
there was a cartoon called The Wizard of Id. I'm not sure it exists anymore. Right. And I remember seeing one where there's a fellow that's just on the road, and someone else passes by and asks how much it would cost to borrow 80 drachmar. And the elder fellow says, well, that'll cost you 200 drachmar. And he says, wow, your interest is pretty high, isn't it? He says, on the contrary, I could care less. So don't ask me why I thought of that. So here, we come to the conclusion. After this person, we're told that they won't lend out their money on interest, not taking a bribe against the innocent. The Talmud gives a strange example about that, by the way, because again, taking a judge to take a bribe, that's just completely prohibited. That doesn't mean you're virtuous, you're a great person if you don't do that. The Talmud says they sort of squeeze it into a weird case of a bribe to a judge to free an innocent person that he was going to free anyway, meaning that it was a weird case where the judge had already decided to free someone. And
right.
the people didn't know that the judge had decided. And so,
and they said, look, I just sold this cow for 300 zoos, and I'll give that to you so that you can free what's his name, even though he was going to free him anyway. But he says, sure, yeah, just give that to me under the table. Yeah, I'll do you that favor. I was going to do it anyway, but sure. I'll go and buy a cow with that.
That might be the case that it's speaking about. Again, see, in each of these cases, if it's a case where the person is not doing something that's explicitly prohibited, that's no big deal. So they try to reframe these in ways where it's especially virtuous.
Yeah, but that's not really against the innocent, though, is it? Because if he's innocent and the judge is going to let him go free, he's not taking a bribe against the innocent. To take a bribe against the innocent is to not let justice prevail, though they are innocent, to not pronounce them as innocent because he's been paid to pronounce them guilty.
Yeah, I don't know if the word "against" here is.
It's not. Maybe it's not explicit. So that's what I've got in that translation.
Accurate.
I'm going to go to my Christian translation, and it says, "Nor does he take a bribe." Yeah, I've got "against" here as well.
Yeah, the word "al" it really means concerning.
Concerning the innocent. Okay.
Yeah, it's like a small thing, but I think it does change everything.
Yeah,
here.
It does. Well, that leaves room for such an example. Yeah.
Exactly. Now here's the big question that bothered me about this psalm. I mean, this is, when I went through this psalm, there was a big question mark in my mind. It begins by asking the question, who really is worthy of dwelling in God's tent and on His mountain, which really means, in the context of the Book of Psalms, not just someone who, would be accepted to hang out in the temple, but it really is speaking, I believe, the temple is the place of God's presence. So I don't think it's really saying that this person's going to, just stay in the temple 24/7. But it's speaking sort of symbolically of the person that is worthy of having this kind of close, tight relationship with God, where God is always with them, and they always have the presence of God. What kind of person will merit that kind of intimacy? And the Talmud has a very, very famous passage in the Talmud where they discuss, how do we know that there are 613 commandments? So last page or so in Tractate Makot. And so they quote a verse in the Bible, Torah tziva lanu Moshe, Moses commanded us the Torah. And they take the word Torah and they take its numerical value, which is 611. So they say Moses commanded 611. And we know that the first two of the Aseret HaDibrot, the first two of the 10 commandments that were given at Sinai, are ones that they heard directly from God. Because when we look at the first two, they're in the first person. I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods before me. God is obviously speaking. And the scripture says that the people freaked out. They couldn't handle this direct revelation. And so they asked Moses to just receive everything for them.
You go and do it, because otherwise we're going to die.
We just can't handle it. It's going to fry us. And so the third of the commandments switches to the third person. Don't take the name of the Lord your God in vain. It should have said, don't take my name in vain. So the Talmud says that Moses commanded 611. We heard two directly from God, total of 613. And then the Talmud goes on to say that King David sort of but condensed them. David condensed them all into 11. That's what the Talmud says, that David took the 613 commandments and he concentrated them, like, reduced them. He's like, I guess, in a zipped file or whatever on a computer.
Right.
He zipped them down into 11, and they quote these 11 virtues in this psalm.
Right.
And then the Talmud goes on. I'm not going to get into all those, but the Talmud says that other people then even reduce them even further. That Isaiah, in chapter 33, verse 15, reduced the 613 commandments to 6. Mm-hmm. And then the prophet Micha, in chapter 6, verse 8, reduced them to 3. And then Isaiah came back and knocked them down to 2 in chapter 56 in Isaiah, verse 1, where he says to guard justice and do righteousness. Mm-hmm. That's the whole Torah is those 2. And then Amos, in chapter 5, verse 4, says, seek me and live. And Amos reduces everything to that verse. And then the Talmud says, well, maybe that verse is referring to seeking the Torah. So Habakkuk in chapter 2, verse 4, reduced everything to one teaching, which is the righteous shall live by their faith.
Beautiful.
And the question is, and it really applies to almost all those other reductions, is that the text is asking the question, who is worthy of having an intimate relationship with God? And then all these lists go on to basically describe people who get along with other people. What we speak about as commandments, ben adam lo chavero, commandments between man and his friend, man and his neighbor, man and other people. But no one seems to cite teachings or scripture that deal with our relationship with God, which seems strange because the question was, how do we have intimacy with God? What makes us worthy of having a connection to God? And then they don't speak about God. They speak about, not charging interest and not lying and not slandering. Nothing about someone who prays a lot and studies the Torah a lot, and someone who meditates on God's presence, and someone who tries to get other people to believe, whatever. It's sort of interesting that happens in this psalm. And if we go 15 psalms ahead, I think it's 15 psalms ahead, to Psalm 30, something similar happens, where it begins. We'll have a chance to speak about this in about 6 months, probably.
That's right.
It begins by saying that it's a psalm for the dedication of the temple, Mizmor Shir Chanukat Habayit, the David, a psalm for the dedication of the temple, of the house of God by David. And you would think that the psalm would speak about the temple. I mean, that's what it introduces, but it doesn't speak at all about the temple. It speaks about, a person, the person's qualities. And so I think those two questions are similar. And I'll just throw in one more thing into the pot here, which is a famous story in the Talmud where someone who's not Jewish comes to two great rabbis, Hillel and Shammai, and says, I want to learn the entire Torah while you stand on one foot, which means basically I got 30 seconds to tell me everything you know. And so Shammai is offended by the question, says, get the hell out of here. He chases him out. And Hillel says, if you want to understand the whole Torah while I'm standing on one foot, he says, what is hateful to you, don't do to your friend. Meaning that if something really annoys you, don't do it to someone else. And he says, that's the whole Torah. That's it. But then he says, the rest is commentary, go and learn. So it's interesting also that, Hillel, in summing up the entire Torah, really reduces it to a sort of stellar human interaction. And the question is, what about our relationship with God? And so,
because it does seem subjective, doesn't it? Whereas the Torah itself is external to our own what we would say is moral, because what we would say may change from any given day to the next. With all of the examples that you've given, I keep thinking I'd like to add to that list the final verses of Kohelet. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all.
Well, there it's interesting that you have the focus on God and his commandments. Now, you could say that let's say half of God's commandments are affecting our relationship with our friends and neighbors, etc. But many of God's commandments are what we call ritual, or dealing with holidays and dietary laws and prayer and Torah study. But at least there it speaks about fearing God. Whereas in so many of the summations, so to speak, of the right kind of life, where Micha, what does Micha say in chapter 6, verse 8? What does God require of you but to, do righteous, act humbly, do justice. There are so many of these summaries of what the good life is in a spiritual way seem to focus exclusively on human interaction. Now, it could be, I'm just hypothesizing here, that, so many people who seek to be righteous, they get real religious, and it's sort of easy to be quote unquote religious. It's easy to go to the temple. It's easy to bring a sacrifice. It's easy to pray. It's easy to study the Torah. And so there is this prevalent phenomenon of the quote unquote religious person. We all know them, the righteous person who is not so righteous when it comes to the way they interact with other people. And so it could be that, here that David is beginning the psalm and asking the question, who's the one that's really, really worthy of living in intimacy with God? So it could be that David is saying it's not just someone who is trying to be intimate with God. That maybe is a starting point. Maybe that's, the easy part of it. But, where the rubber hits the road is where that person is in their human interactions. Because, there are plenty of people who, pray a lot, but they also speak negatively about others. And that may be more difficult to achieve excellence in those areas. And it could be that that's part of what's going on. We see this in the Bible a lot, when the prophets, scream at the people who are bringing sacrifices, but they don't treat others properly. And so all the prophets, scolded these people and said, God doesn't want, in Isaiah chapter 1, God doesn't want your sacrifices. He wants you to do good and to, treat the widow and the orphan with respect and kindness, etc. Because again, it's easy for you to be religious and show up at the temple and bring a sacrifice. That's easy. But what's really the mark of a righteous, holy person is whether that religiousness translates into the interpersonal realm. It could also be, so that might be one part of this. It might also be that not just that it's artificially dividing our lives into these two realms, our relationship with other people and our relationship with God, but I think that what our teachings reflect is the idea that everything really can be godly. We artificially, I think, sometimes divide the spiritual realm from the interpersonal realm. Almost like Augustine had his city of God. Or you find in the New Testament, render unto Caesar which is Caesar's, and unto man, unto God which is God's. And I think that the Jewish biblical and Talmudic frame of reference is always, no, it's artificial. There is only one realm.
There's no division, and the individual should have integrity throughout.
Yeah, and what I think it means is here, in terms of this psalm, is that these activities themselves can be spiritual, meaning that the way we interact with other people, it's not just that I'm a nice guy, but I'm actually behaving in a spiritual way. As an example, eating. People don't think of eating as a holy activity, as a spiritual activity. But in Torah sources, the way we eat can be spiritual, meaning that there's an idea of uplifting the physical to become a spiritual activity, to raise the earth up to the heavens. And so it's not just that being honest and being careful with our speech is a reflection of, a nice guy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are people who are not godly. There are people who are secular. There are people who are atheists that are nice people. I think David here is speaking about the kind of person that elevates this entire realm, the interpersonal realm, to do it in a way that's holy, that reflects godliness, that we should be able to see the impression of God's hand upon a person who lives in a godly way. That we don't measure godliness only by, a person's behavior in a synagogue or in a study hall or, when they're interacting with God, but we can really or should be able to see holiness and godliness and spiritual integrity in the way they do everything in life, from the way they eat to the way they conduct their business to the way they interact with their coworkers and their neighbors and their family. I think that might be what David is trying to teach here.
Now, very quickly, I just want to throw this into the mix. Who may abide in your tabernacle? Who may dwell in your holy hill? And I'm reading now from the notes in my New King James Study Bible. Certainly no one, except Jesus the Messiah. There it is.
Is that what it says?
I'm not kidding. This is what it says. Certainly no one is except Jesus the Messiah. That's what they say.
I have something similar. I mean, I was looking also in the New King James Version Study Bible where it says in verse 2 that here where it speaks about the person who, does righteousness. Mm-hmm. So here I see in the notes that it speaks of relative righteousness, not absolute righteousness. Right. For no one is innocent before God. So the text here, though, does not indicate that it's speaking about a relative righteousness. I think that's a spin on what the text actually says. The text seems to be speaking about someone who acts with righteousness without tempering it or without modifying it. It doesn't say the person who acts with sort of relative righteousness. And I found in another study Bible, the MacArthur Study Bible, John MacArthur, who's a very famous and popular evangelical scholar. So he says in his description of this entire psalm, something I think very revealing. He says that the saved sinner is described as exhibiting indications of ethical integrity. So from his point of view, what kind of person is able to live like this? It can only be someone who is saved. And we know from his perspective that there's only one way in which a person can be saved, which is by embracing the death of the Messiah and the atoning blood. So, I would, if I had a chance to chat with MacArthur, I would ask,
I'd love to record that program, by the way.
Oh, his program?
No, yours. When you get to have a chat with MacArthur, I'm just saying now, let's record that. I'll give him a call tomorrow and we'll see what we can organize. What would you say to him?
Well, I would wonder, these are old questions, but, were people like Isaiah and David saved? They didn't have access to someone who died for their sins. Were they people who would be able to exhibit indications of ethical integrity? Another question I would ask is he implying that people who are not Christian are not able to live like this? It seems to be, stating that there's sort of an exclusive hold that the only people who are able to live like this. He's saying that the people described in this psalm are, they don't have this available to them unless they're a saved sinner. Mm-hmm. And I understand that his belief system is that, you're not going to be saved through your own actions. You're not going to be saved by living this way. his belief is that this kind of behavior is only possible once a person is saved. That he would claim that, these are the fruits, these are the evidences of someone who has been saved from their sins. And the Torah, I believe, very strongly says the exact opposite, that we are able to achieve forgiveness for our sins. We're able to even live exemplary moral and ethical and spiritual lives without having to have some vicarious sacrifice offered on our behalf. That each one of us is able to come to God through our own work, through our own strivings. And the Book of Psalms repeats this so many times.
So many times. It's in the study notes here, it goes on to say, Jesus makes us feel at home in the presence of the Father. It quotes, or it references rather, Hebrews chapter 4. When it goes on about Jesus being now the high priest, fulfilling that role. And verse 16 of Hebrews 4, let us therefore come boldly into the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. And that's how they that's how they do that one. But in any case, Psalm 15.
Psalm 15.
Psalm 15.
Brought to you by God.
Indeed. Thank you, my friend. Rabbi Michael Skobac, once again, always a great privilege to have you on and go through the Psalms chapter by chapter. The website, again, JewsForJudaism.ca. That's for Jews for Judaism in Canada, JewsForJudaism.ca. Thank you, Michael Skobac, for coming back on.
Thank you, Jono. And I look forward to chapter 16 next time.
You've been listening to Truth to You with me, Jono Vandor. Join me on the coming Truth to You Israel tour. Details at our website, truth2u.org. That's truth2u.org. Thank you for your company, and I hope you'll join us again. Until next time, Shalom.